Well, apologies for not being here last week. A fortnight ago, I was talking about relationship and the openness, the creativity, the meeting, not as two separate things, or many separate things, but as relationship as really the realising that we never were, in that sense, separate. So today's talk is really about what gets in the way of relationship. And actually I want to talk about that in terms of identity. And, one of my favourite images from our founder, Joko Beck, which she doesn't use very much, I only know of one talk where she actually mentions it, but it struck me at the time as a nice image as to where we mess up endlessly. We're like ice cubes, she says, rattling around, taking chunks out of each other, sharp edges poking into each other all the time. It'd be much better if we were a bit softer, if we melted a bit, if we went a bit mushy. And as the goal of a lifetime of practice, or whatever we want to call it, realisation, enlightenment, the idea of going a bit mushy seemed like a really nice image of that. And I came across another instance of this icy metaphor, icy image in Diane Rossetto, where she talks about a small act of freezing, which she herself did. I felt, yes. Diane is talking about turning somebody else into an ice cube. And actually, maybe turning herself into an ice cube too, but we'll talk about that. So Diane just mentions, she was talking to her husband and talking about somebody that they both know, saying, the trouble with Harry is he's really unreliable. And at that moment, as she says it, a little light bulb goes on in her head and goes, hang on, what am I doing here? It's ages since we've seen Harry. How do I know what's been happening to him, and how do I know how his life's unfolding? She realised she's making a judgment on Harry, and she's taking what is a living, breathing, multi-dimensional, sentient being existing through time, ever-changing. And of course, last time we were talking about Philip Bromberg's idea of self-states, this idea of our own actual discontinuity moment by moment. And she's taking that unfathomable richness and going, Harry's unreliable, isn't he? She's freezing him into an identity, and she actually talks about freezing. So in that sense, in terms of Joko's ice cube image, it's exactly what we do. Turn people into ice cubes. Freeze them. And the weird thing is, as we'll hopefully begin to tease out a bit, by so doing, we turn ourselves into ice cubes as well. We freeze ourselves. Yes, what can we say about this? So identifying. Well, I suppose really in the sense that by creating an identity for ourselves or other people, in this case Harry, he's unreliable. We're actually misidentifying him. And that this is actually true, at the end of the day, of any identity we can possibly make, because an identity is a sweeping generalisation that gathers up one person's whole life, or maybe, millions, billions of people's whole lives, and goes, you're that. And of course, we're never going to get this right. We make assumptions. Well, we all know about the French. Tens of millions of people. And we're going to make assumptions about them based on that. Or women. We know what women are like. Or or we know what a real man is. And as soon as we're creating these identities, and okay, most of these identities we're not actually creating, we're just drawing down popular received, well, can't really call it wisdom, can we? Received ideas about the world, about each other, or about ourselves for that matter. If I go, well, I'm a man, I'm a true Englishman, or whatever, well, yes and no. One of the key lessons of not separate, of emptiness, is that therefore everything is relational. All kinds of identity are relational. They don't exist as separate things, complete things. They exist in relationship to each other. I mean, sometimes in the kind of complementary identities, parent and child, I'm my mother's son, I'm my children's father, or my wife's husband. These are all obviously relational identities. I'm only my wife's husband because she's there. But in fact, all identities are relational in a sense. There are no white people unless we point to some people and go, you're black, and create an identity for them. There are no men unless we split off half the human race and go, oh, you're women. Identities only exist in relationship. Sometimes as this, this kind of complementary pair, sometimes there's a much wider set of choices. But however this works, that's what's happening. And we're freezing, we're judging, we're solidifying out. Identities always carry with them inequality, which is a theme we're going to kind of explore as we go on. Because usually identities emerge out of different kind of inequalities, and it doesn't mean that, everything's always on one side good, one side bad. It can be far more complex than that. But there will be inequality. Obviously, as soon as we have identities, we have assumptions, and as Diane Rossetto again calls them, requirements. What are my requirements of this relationship, my relationship with my wife, given our identities as husband and wife, or my children? Obvious questions. Who gets to do the job? Who gets to do the childcare? Who gets to do the housework? Who's expected to earn the money? Identities change through time, but they still come to us as sets of possible assumptions, requirements. Or remember back all kinds of idiocy, really. Relationships with my children, being the parent, standing on my sense of identity as a parent. I don't think I ever said you can't talk to me like that, but that's the assumption. Come on, let's recognise show some respect. Who's got the power here? And you go, you idiot. How on earth did you find yourself saying that or in that position? And yet, we're doing this kind of thing absolutely all the time. And they're always generating inequality coming out of that. Sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes it can be life or death. And all of these things are to do with judgment, to do with holding to account, to do with assigning responsibility. You're not supposed to treat me like that. You're not allowed to treat me like that. Or vice versa. I have rights here. And in each of these things, we're freezing out. And our language itself tends to do this, the way we use words, even having names for identities. We're making generalizations, abstractions, which tend always towards fixity and tend always towards judgment. And so constantly as we move through our life, we're freezing other people. But because identity is always relationship, we freeze ourselves in exactly the same motion, at exactly the same time. Look, if we take that idea of relationship, about the recognizing my own multiplicity, your own multiplicity, about the fact that I can only possibly know who I am through knowing that there's a you and you and you, and the way this starts in our first relationships with our carers, but it's fundamentally the same deal. We tell each other who we are, not as a kind of you're that, but just out of relationship with each other, out of mutuality. We find out who we are and what we are as a we, and then obviously as just an I, a me, a you. With identity, identity is absolutely necessary for real relationships. I couldn't meet my children and go, well, let's see how things work today. It's, well, no, I am the parent, you are the child at this point in time. But if there isn't that fundamental openness, that recognition of each other's mutual necessity, what these identities do and the identity aspect of whatever relationship we're in, okay, it gives us a way of meeting each other, but it also keeps us apart. I am the parent, you are the child. I am the husband, you are the wife. That mutuality is impossible. It's replaced by reciprocity, which is a useful thing, a good thing. But it's not the same as this open and dynamic relationship. And it's certainly not a recognition of myself as vulnerable, moment by moment, shifting, changing, as you are too. But it's no, this is where I sit, and you're over there. Now we might think this is just something, kind of thing people do, human nature. Maybe we say, oh no, it's an effective language, or whatever. But I think it's really important that we realise that this isn't actually an individual thing. This is to do with the way that the world works, that the world is organised. And the way that the world is organised is into these little bubbles, these little puddles we call nation states. And if you like, the fundamental model of this judging and freezing is, of course, the law, the way that the law works, and not just our legal system. If you think, it is, I have all kinds of identities which are morphable, which change. I get married, suddenly I'm a husband. I have children, suddenly I'm a father. What stays constant within all of this is my legal identity. Okay, I can change the name. Maybe at some points in some time I can even change my legal gender. That's all still fundamental to this same continuing legal identity. That's vital, because that's the only way I can actually, at the end of the day, be held to account, be judged, be made responsible according to a set of abstract principles, our laws. This you may do, this you may not do. This both enables us and limits us. If I want to leave the country, go to another little puddle, another nation state, I need a passport. For that, I need my birth certificate. If I want to drive a car, ditto. If I want to open a bank account, same thing. And of course this identity will enable me, it'll let me get an education, it'll give me healthcare, all kinds of good things. It'll help me realise some of my dreams, my wishes, my fantasies, my desires. But on the principle and on the absolute understanding that it will also hold me to an account, that it will pin me down as an identity. You know, like in the old days you used to catch butterflies and pin them to a board. It's that fundamental, that extreme, got me. It tells me who I am. And if who I am is about this making up a consistent, a continuous self-story of this person moving through time. Yes, I was born then, I have that name, I was assigned that gender at birth, and I can see all these other episodes as I go through life. It's that fundamental identity which holds all of these others together and gives me a sense, well, no, absolutely, I am that person. Now, maybe I'm happy with that. Maybe I embrace that identity fully. It's wonderful. Maybe I spend my whole life kicking against it, feeling the weight of that authority. Doesn't really matter. Either way, that's who I am. That's who the world will treat me as, who I'm expected to respond as. And it becomes so second nature that of course it's natural. Of course I'm that. I can't conceive of not being that. It's an interesting idea, but the French philosopher Louis Althusser, writing in the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, talks about this, fundamental hailing of you. Hey, you, stop, says the policeman. And that's what? As you turn, that's where you become you. You become the you that the state has you as being, the you that, well, what's important about being this you? Well, it's important that you can be held to account. It's important that you can be judged. Why? Because you're a separate person with their own intention, their own ability to act on their own ideas, their own beliefs, their own desires. And as such, you will be judged. You will be held to account. And it's fascinating, I think, to link up that, little observation of Diane's just catching herself, that moment of judging Harry, holding him to account. There's another nice moment that Diane talks about in relationship to this. One of her students, and a little moment of insight of his. He's on the telephone with his sister, and for the umpteenth time she's asking him for cash, asking him for some dollars. And he realises every time this happens, he just gets so angry. She's a complete screw-up, he shouts at Diane. So she sends him off to sit with this. What actually happens? Read a little bit I can read. Rosetto points to the way our responses to others always show us something about ourselves, our deeper assumptions, our fears and demands that the world should be a certain way, and instead to allow ourselves to sit with these as koans about ourselves. She gives the example of one of her students raging that his sister is such an irresponsible screw-up because she repeatedly asks for money from him. Working with his anger, he came to realise that his words, this is Diane, were spoken as a reaction, and he'd just frozen his sister in a negative way. He asked himself the very simple but powerful question, how do I think she should be? What do I require her to be? What are my assumptions about how somebody in this situation should be? Diane says the should-bes of our thinking are our requirements. In this case, she should always take care of herself and be self-sufficient. He found that he often included himself in that judgment. So when he needed to ask for help, he noticed that he often felt uncomfortable. He found to his surprise that the way he valued most people and the extent to which he was open to them was the degree to which they matched his requirement. He found that he believed that he and everyone else should always be able to take care of themselves, to be self-sufficient. Such beliefs are what we hold on to dearly because they make us feel safe and in control. Which immediately makes me want to ask, well, hang on. Why does the idea that I don't have to look after myself and I'm the only person I can ever rely on, why on earth would that make me feel safe and in control? And if we think about, well, what Buddhism tells us about the world, absolute interdependence, we'll rely on each other completely in every possible respect, from hoping that the sun will shine enough to grow the plants, to grow the animals and the rest of the world, to just, the day-to-day. If the server's not working, we can't meet here. My bank account doesn't function. Every possible way in which we're actually interconnected and interrelated. And yet, out of this, I acquire the fantasy that I'm separate, that I'm somehow self-reliant, I'm managing on my own. In certain respects, again, this is the story I tell about me. But for me to tell this story about me, I need other people to be a certain way. And so he splits down the middle. Everybody. There are the people who can cope, like me, and there are the people who cannot cope. And they're other. And they're failures, and they're frankly annoying. And the role of his sister here is really problematic because she's my sister. She's my family. I grew up with her. And yet she's like those other people. And this is one of the key things which we do again and again and again with identity. We use it to other others. They're like that. And their being like that reassures me about the story that I'm telling about me, because I can tell an opposite story about them. So when that is challenged, but my sister? That's really difficult. And when I'm challenged, I'm going to get fearful. And when I get fearful, chances are I'm going to get angry. And suddenly we're a really pointy, really sharp ice cube. Because he's freezing his sister, but he's also freezing himself. And that's what he eventually comes to see. And we might talk about that another time. So the question is, in our lives, how far are we? Ice cubes, spiky, bumping into one another, taking chunks out of each other, and then wondering why, people are bumping into us and taking chunks out of us. Or can we recognise the kind of rather mushy nature of life? So say identity. We need it. We do it. It's what we do all the time because we couldn't really have any kind of meaningful relationship without aspects of identity and identification coming into it. But identities are always liable, they're always misidentification to a degree. And they're always liable to freeze and just not correspond. And when they not correspond enough, we get real tension, we get problems. But in any respect, to the extent that we're in identification with each other, we're not in the mutuality of real relationship that's actually meeting the other as complex, multiple, vulnerable, human, or even vulnerable, animal, plant, sentient being. We share that. We have that in common with all beings. How does this relate to the nature of the world, the nature of non-separation? Well, in identification, we're always allowing ourselves to see things as separate, as different. I suppose the one qualification I should give here is we say, well, hang on, what about identity as, am I saying that we should just try and do without identity? Well, no, because it's clearly really important in certain contexts. And we can say that if I am characterised as unequal in any respect, whether that's experiencing the reality of living in a sexist, misogynist society, or a racist society, or a transphobic society, or a homophobic society, then it seems entirely reasonable to go, well, you're identifying me as this, aren't you? You're identifying me as being inferior, failing, lacking in some respect. Okay, that's an identity you're putting on me. Well, what are my options here? Either deny it or actually work with it. And of course, in reality, people try both. Okay, I'm gay, but I'm just like you. Okay, that's essential. Or alternatively, well, no, I'm gay and proud of it. I'll ... But even these identities are always necessarily defensive, at least in so far as they are identities. They're to an extent accepting and allowing. What changes that? Well, I think what changes that is when these identities themselves move in the direction of relationship. And here's another incredibly important word we can add in here, and that's community. And I know that, you talk about the gay community or the trans community or whatever, but to the extent that these just aren't platitudes, to the extent that these are involving real connection, relationship, what turned the civil rights movement in America beyond an identity? Well, it was the really complex relationships involved in that, not just one-to-one between different churches, different groups, different organisations, really recognising and moving forward together into new territory, finding out what can it mean to be black? What can it mean within the United States? And it's really, it's really meaningful when people talk about my community in that sense, because this is something way beyond an identity. This is about actual coming together, whether that's at a level of individuals or a level of organisations, families, churches, whatever. Similarly with feminism. If it's, well, I'm a woman and being a woman is this, well, so what? But actually when women come together and they, well, okay, how do we approach this aspect of life? What's it mean? What's your experience? How does that relate to my experience? Then we're talking about relationship and we're talking about community and something which is potentially infinitely rich, infinitely open. We're back in the realm of openness and possibility. And that's where we connect up with not separate. A life, a universe which isn't simply determined. We don't know it all in advance. We can't just live a life according to the rules. No. We're improvising. We're dancing with each other, as each other. That's what makes the difference. And it only works in this way because ultimately, things are, in the Buddhist sense, empty, which is to say, not separate, which is to say we meet ourselves in each other, with each other, and each other in ourselves. So in all these ways, do we experience ourselves as hard, rigid crystals? Or can we experience and allow, even celebrate, the slight sogginess, the mushiness that is the honest experiencing of our actual life as it is, and celebrate that.